Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a very snowy Concordia University's floor space. Thank you for joining us for today's event, the next episode in the AIRS live podcast, in the theater department, artists in residence. Now, to help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube, live from floor space, and we are located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. In Floor Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge. We co-create daily activities. We examine research questions and projects happening across the university. We're running today's event also as a live stream Zoom meeting. So anyone joining us there, if you have any comments or questions, pop those into the chat. We can read them out later on. Those of you here in the audience also, if you have any questions, that's wonderful. Just raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone over to you later. With that, it's my pleasure to hand it over to the host of our podcast today, and also the chair of the Department of Theater, Shauna Janssen. Shauna, great to have you.
Thanks, Doug, and everyone at Fourth Space for supporting us again and always, being great hosts. And thank you to special guests today. This is the second AIRS live podcast we've done for the theater department. We did one in the fall with other artists in residence and faculty who are working in regular-based courses, but also in more of our performance production-based courses. So welcome Leslie Baker, Ange Loft, Shauna Carroll, and Mindy Parfit. Thanks for being here. I'm going to kick this off by getting you to actually introduce a little bit more about yourselves and your practice and what you're each doing or going to be doing or imagining you're doing with students in the Department of Theater this year, this winter term. Kind of the theme of this talk is around your perspectives on the role of research in your performance creation work, and what does that mean, and how does that translate to teaching and your pedagogy and working with students now. So I don't know who would like to kick it off. Maybe Ange?
I'll start.
Great.
I'll
thanks.
start. Great. My name's Ange Loft. I'm from Gahnawaga. So I've been kind of raised just about 15 minutes away from here. I was actually a student at Concordia in I graduated in maybe 2005. But I've been, kicking around in Toronto for quite a few years, primarily working in community arts. Community arts toward theater creation, so working with a whole bunch of different populations, artists, kind of trying to figure out how to extend their practice, a lot of visual practices to community settings, and then working through like kind of performative modes. So spent quite a long time working with people that way, and then spent quite a bit of time working at Center for Indigenous Theater, doing story creation and kind of like collaborative methodology. And then, I mean, between all that time, I'd been for a long time a touring musician and creator in my own right. So right now I consider myself a, interdisciplinary artist. I work through voice, I work through wearable sculpture, I work through kind of like history research. I just came back from India researching calico fabric for like a going ahead theater project, right? So how long it takes to make things takes a long time in my world. In Toronto, I'm pretty well known for a project called this Talking Treaties Initiative. That's run as a co-production with Jambalese Theater. So I've been doing that since quite a few years, since about 2015 or so. But that's in its legacy phase, so I'm free. Come back to Montreal and try to figure out how to kind of reapply some of those methodologies with kind of local groups. Yeah.
I'm Shauna Carroll. I am co-founding artistic director of the company The Seven Fingers, Les Sept Doigts de la Main, which is a theater company, but also a circus, dance, multimedia company. And I myself was a trapeze artist for 20 years. And in fact, also doing interdisciplinary work, but more on the side of incorporating acrobatics and movement and that whole side of it, and create and direct and choreograph inside my own company and extracurricularly as well. So that's more or less it. Is that enough?
Great.
Hi, my name is Mindy Parfit. I live and work in Vancouver, and I'm also an alum here. I graduated in 2001, I think. And I run a theater company in Vancouver called The Search Party. We do contemporary work, script-based work, and the company focuses on connecting design with text. So that's the design element of my work is a really big part of my process, and how I address sort of any kind of script analysis or working on a text is through the visual world of a piece. My practice has also incorporated a lot of community-based work and devised work, creating with groups of people, and usually that incorporates a lot of multimedia, working with video artists and visual artists, visual arts, painters predominantly. And I am also a freelance director. And here, the class that I'm doing is a short play festival, so I'm working with directors and actors and stage management and creating a festival of 6 short plays. So basically I'm creating some context for them to create that work in, talking about my own practice as a director, helping them create some, how to create safe space and interesting dynamic space, and how to approach a text, how to create a schedule, all those kind of things. So yeah, it's great. I'm really excited.
So hello, I'm Leslie Baker. And I work under the umbrella of a company called The Bakery. And I call it I'm a slow theater maker, because I feel like it takes me a while to create something. And I guess it's also in kind of giving myself permission to do so and take the time I need in developing something. And what I tend to develop and with collaborators is looking at formal qualities in a performance, like what's the structure, what are the signifiers, but then also on a visceral level, how do we embody the story or the content? Coming at it from viewpoints perspective, a history of viewpoints, under the lineage of Mary Overlie, the creator of viewpoints, and then physical approach to acting. Type of technique. And so then the results initially were adaptations of plays as a source of inspiration, and then the last couple of creations have been more inspired by a subject and creating a work around that. Yeah, and here I'm working with a group of lovely folks. We are working on a new adaptation of the Oresteia by Robert Icke, written in 2015. And we're looking at like the serious kind of theatrical textural drama of it, at approaching it through viewpoints, process, and physical approach to acting, Grotowski-esque type of work. Yeah.
I realize.
We'll go back to Ange and Sheena about what you're working on with the students, and then we'll go from there. Yeah, perfect.
Exactly. I'm teaching 351 PERC, so that is community arts of engagement, which is interesting because it's funny, I'm not really a community artist anymore. I'm going to go let's go into real theater. Let's see what this feels like. But I love teaching community art. I love, for a long time I was working with exactly Jembly's teaching this project, this Art Fair Essentials. So kind of weaving a little bit of that work into it, but also deeply focused on the kind of archaeological remains connected to the city of Montreal. So we have some field trips. We're going to the corner of Peel in Montreal to discuss some pottery patterns and kind of explorations of embodied understandings of kind of the pottery lineage that's here, that's not too far in the past from my own community. So tracking up some of those conversations, this is kind of the form of my art practice in general, but using it in a way to get arts-based education and research, right? How do we generate something that's useful? How do we generate text really quickly? How do we reflect back? How do I provide the basket and the structure and then throw in the content for us to come back out with some quick durational multi-arts performances by the end? So that's my goal, and it's a quick time, right? Between March 3rd and April, I think, 10th. So it's a pretty tight turnover. So a couple field trips, a couple literal investigations, a lot of kind of riffing off of some of the work I've done before here at Studio 303, like facilitating week-long workshops there for 2 years in a row, and then also I had a residency for a while at the Centaur Theater. So I have a project that's been in development there since for about 3 years now, which is this Stone and Bone Spectacular, which we've interviewed like dozens of regional Indigenous historians and archaeologists. So I have a data set. And so I think that's always like something that I'm intrigued by, figuring out what to do with next. All of my projects kind of have these funky phases of digging too much information, figuring out how much we can play with, and then figuring out what comes next, like what the educational components are, what the kind of like publication performance, publication aspects are, or films are. So this is like, I guess, level 0.5 of that project. This is, active research with the student body that will eventually not turn into anything, but live with them, but I guess kind of also feed into the kind of new suite of work that's being developed for the city, including the Stone and Bone Spectacular that's showing up probably in September next year at, the Centaur. So I feel like the students in this class, they'll get a chance to see the work in action coming up, or see kind of like the relationship to the work that we're already creating there. Yeah. On top of it, I guess I have like some research sets. I love activity packs, I make activity packs for, as part of my other work, like how do we just step into a series of questions about place? How do we generate some content from poetry prompts and kind of like, experimental graphic prompts? A work that I made for the Center for Canadian Architecture last year came with like a component book that I wrote called Visibly Iroquoian, which is like the application of pottery patterns towards architectural understandings. So I'm actually facilitating them through that in companion with the rest of the research. So it's a research-heavy class, but also, right, on the ground, trying to make it work, community arts generative stuff. So you gotta have the stuff to put in to get something good back. Very.
Thanks, Ange. Oh, Shauna, I just saw your work at the CCA.
Yeah, great.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So I'm teaching a class called the Obsessions Lab, and it's about learning to create through your obsessions, which I was sort of describing as passion that doesn't come up for air. And just, the majority of the work I do is blank page creation, and so there's not really an assigned source material. So in fact, the first thing you have to do is sort of figure out the gravitational pull and where your own needle is pointing. And so it's interesting we're talking about research, because a lot of the research we're doing in this particular class is really sort of internal, and that each one has to kind of excavate and sort of figure out where their compass is, where their needle is pointing. Sort of along the lines that on the one hand, going from a place of pleasure and play and that type of obsession of the things that we just, get so much joy from, that what type of fuel there is, what type of motor there is, if you lean into it. And then also the type of obsession where it's the thing that just won't leave you alone, that you feel like it's almost like a blockage in the pipe, that if you don't address it and bring it to life, you won't be able to move on to the next project, the next thing. And what would you say you are the world's expert on? That you've been so obsessed with this thing that you're the most apt person to create on that subject matter. So there's a lot of work along those levels. It's a great deal of fun, and very personal, because of course it starts out with the more not superficial, but the more externalized obsessions of various musicians or artists that people have gravitated towards, and then with time the workshop became much more talking about experiences through their lives, or issues that have really preoccupied them, and so it's gotten very personal. So it's interesting. Yeah.
Thanks, all of you, for those introductions to your own practice and a little bit about what you're doing in the department, the theater department, with the students. Just noticing a couple of keywords that came up. One was interdisciplinary, this notion of being interdisciplinary, and whether it's drawing from visual sources, doing embodied research, the viewpoints I'm thinking of. I don't know why I'm thinking about viewpoints as research, but I do kind of feel like there is something going on in terms of an embodied engagement with space, for example. So I just wanted to kind of put out there, like, what do you mean by interdisciplinary? Like, what is an interdisciplinary practice? Like, and how do we unpack that in our teaching and in our research? Because you were also referencing that quite a bit, Ange, in the work that you're doing. So, like, what does that mean to you guys? Interdisciplinary work. That old chestnut.
Yeah. I can start.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I would say part of the answer to that question is about seeking inspiration or impulse from different mediums. So when I'm approaching a work, or just even in my day-to-day life, seeing either images or ideas or movement that speaks to me or pushes me or challenges me. I always want the work that I do to develop a different part of either something that I'm thinking about or something that I feel like as a director I want to challenge myself with, or something that I've never done that I feel like, I don't know how to do that, and so that's interesting for me. And so then I find there's different mediums or different approaches to addressing those new places for me, those sort of fresh places. And I also find that working with artists who predominantly work in different mediums, that they also have different approaches. You know, a visual artist has a much more solitary practice, usually, than a theater artist does. And so they bring into the room a different energy or a different impulse. And so I think that, for me, that's also very interesting. I always love, as a director, for me, I love the moment when I get into tech and I feel like the family's together. You know, everybody's come together, all the designers together, the actors are together, like everybody's here, and now all the pieces are coming together. And I love that part of it. It's so invigorating for me. So for me, that's part of the interdisciplinary part of it, is like having the sound designer there and you know, all of those different artists in the space working towards a common goal or outcome. That is what it's for me.
Well, I would say, I will even just go back to, it's interesting because when we founded our company, the Seven Fingers, our first goal was we didn't want it to be definable. And in fact, it was a really sort of challenging thing from a marketing standpoint, because it's not what marketing people want. They want to be able to put you in a box. But you know, we as I said, we were a circus company, did acrobatics, but then we also wanted to be a theater company and also wanted to be a dance company and have visual art, and so it was always the goal. Sort of the very notion of interdisciplinary was sort of the vision of you know, the founding of the company, and you know, it's not, you know, decompartmentalizing it, but also blurring the lines. And I think in general, new forms are created by making hybrid forms, and it's the way art has evolved. It's the way cuisine has evolved, and there's always that little period when that hybrid form has been created where no one knows what to call it, and figure out which category it goes into. And I mean, it's interesting for me as well, because even just as a circus person, circus by nature is interdisciplinary in the literal sense of, whereas in a ballet, everyone's a ballet dancer. In a circus, you'll have, you know, the clown is doing, you know, physical theater, commedia dell'arte, whatever. The trapeze artist is doing, you know, strength and grace dancing in the air. The juggler is doing something that requires, you know, dexterity. And each discipline is so different, and even a different art form in a way. So that's always been kind of the basis of circus. And so I think that coming from that, it's one reason that I feel like every time we create a show, we just feel like the whole palette is available. You know, why not use visual art here? Why not, you know, work with the composer to create a new piece of music? And I think it's something everyone does, but it's just so interesting for me because literally the word discipline is how we would define in circus, how we would define, like, I do trapeze, that is my discipline. So I just kind of see that as an extension from personally from my roots, but just sort of what, the essence of what I've always loved doing.
When I first was using the term, I was thinking of it in like, okay, visual artist as set designer, composer to do sound, and pull from different, I guess, artistic disciplines for the creation of live performance. And it was very fruitful, but I also realized how specific the world of theater is by doing that, and like all these unknowns that I'd never named within a discipline that there is. So while it brought a lot of newness, it also helped me be more specific in what I understood of the form of I was working in. Like a set designer has different concerns than a painter, say on a two-dimensional or flat surface. So that's what I think it still means that to me. I do like to blend different ways of communicating a story, whether it's more physical at times, or visual, or oral, textual. So, but I don't know if that's interdisciplinary. I was just using different codes of relating a story. Yeah. Then I'm also like, well, what's the current language around interdisciplinary? I don't know. But that's what it means to me at this point. Do you want to?
Yeah, I wish there was a better term also. Even for what I call myself, like I have to say an interdisciplinary artist because I haven't chosen a form. Like I spent so many of my years kind of moving between forms and spent so much time outside of theater that I didn't call myself a theater artist. I can't call myself a theater artist because I only have 5 productions under my belt. You know, you're not a theater artist, you dabble. But I live in interdisciplinary creation. And I feel like taking the stage out of the game has been something that's really been significant for me. Like I operate in public history spaces, in kind of workshop spaces, in academic spaces, outside and beyond any theater space. I haven't worked except in a theater space except for developmental workshops. And I find that the interdisciplinary factor is one of the most useful things, particularly working with the populations I'm working with in general. When I'm working with emerging artists or emerging student artists who don't know they're artists yet, right? It's the whole game. Let's try to figure out how we're gonna get something. Let's figure out where the juice is in your story. Let's figure out how to use these tools, these research tools. I set them off on poetry prompts and gestural drawing activities and, responding through whatever we're working through. And I have so many forms I like to play with. As a community artist, I think who spent so much time working cross-disciplinarily and with so many other people, I've gained so much just small tidbits of other people's practices, and then I'm stunned when you merge them. I think about moving clay sculpture through, I don't know, whatever we're talking about, and the capacity of building and seeing what happens when we collaboratively throw our fingers on something, and the stories that come from that kind of gathering. And I feel I think there's a better word for it, but I feel my goal, and I guess transferring that work to a performative space is often how do we take what you're playing with, whatever form it might be. You might make a zine, you might make a weird graphic book for us that ultimately has the outcome, but let's figure out how to make it performative, right? Let's figure out how to make it durational so it's not one and done, and then let's figure out how to make it a little multidisciplinary, right? Let's give it some, so you have things you want to work with, you have the skill sets you want to experiment with. That person knows how to make that sound so well, so how do we pull this together, right? And I feel that kind of work is always at the forefront, how does it flip and switch together really well? And that's what I'm really looking for in kind of all the things we're playing across, yeah.
Actually, can I add something?
Of course.
It's interesting because actually I'm in my current class in the Obsessions Lab. The first exercise was collaging. It was through just gathering all the images through Obsessions and then using the collage. And I asked them to do shorts, and I had them do a poem, write a song, a stand-up comedy routine, make a dance, do a piece of theater, a scene, and just as just in 2 days, really just a lot of shorts. And I mean, not that that's particularly original, but just meaning like my goal was saying I want this material that you've now excavated. How does it sing? How does it move? Where's the humor? Where's the melody? All of those things. And I felt like not only was it just a great way of them, first of all, maybe discovering voices they didn't know they had and skills they didn't know they had, but also sort of revealing truths about the work that they might have a tendency to only see verbally or only see through images, and then to force themselves to find what the humor was or what the song was. It kind of created this sort of like comprehensive understanding of the same piece. And so that was, as you were speaking, actually was realizing that was a big part of it, was the interdisciplinary aspect. It's like it completes your, it's the different parts of the brain receive different types of information. So by using these different voices, it's like you make a more complete expression. So that was the other thing I thought of.
Yeah, thanks for that. Those reflections. I mean, yeah, I don't know what's the current, like it's been a buzzword for years, right? Decades. And I guess its meaning changes depending on context and who's in the practice and who the collaborators are, like more generally. But I like to think that also there's this element of surprise by what you might feel challenged by, or your own like preconceived notions of what something is, the discipline is, the practice is somehow transformed, maybe even just temporarily. And then it becomes something else. And kind of thinking about the risk in those explorations, and that also kind of being a way of thinking about creative practice as a form of research. Like again, I'm not trying to hit that one over the head too much, but just kind of thinking about the pleasure along with the challenges of giving oneself permission to actually feel like you're doing research creatively. So, or so that like you're playing with these sets of materials, or you're mixing these sets of materials and modes of performativity, et cetera, that in itself is a form of research. And that it's sometimes hard to say that or do that out loud, especially as makers, but also as collaborators. So anyway, just another point of reflection there on the importance, I guess, of who we bring around what we're doing, and when we're working with students, what's the invitation to come around the thing that you want to be investigating, I guess. So I don't know if that's a question as much as it is a statement.
I'm just thinking a little bit about where that work lives.
Yeah.
For my own experience,
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about it not being within the theater realm, I tend to work in the visual and contemporary art realm, right? Like I'm a facilitator of the discussions outside of those practices, right? Like I work with like the Toronto Biennial endlessly, like right, when we're just doing things and people asking for activations. The last time I was asked to do something at Concordia was actually because of the gallery across the hall, to engage, on the fly with some of the participants that were coming to attend their Art of Rebellion installation, right? Looking back on how do we engage with theatrical prompts, with things that have been left in the past, with artifacts of previous productions. How do we create something just really generative, quick, and throw it up on its feet? Because I feel like that's one of the barriers I've had experienced, particularly in kind of like entering the theater world, was the limitations actually of having to feel like I had to make like a complete picture, when I realized that what I want to do is hone in on specific concepts, right? And sometimes you don't need the full stage and world to be able to explore those things. You kind of I let my work for a long time live in the visual art and kind of like experiential realm. Yeah, it's like education realm more than the actual theatrical realm. And I really do think it's really the place for interdisciplinary art, and I think that's why theater is with visual arts, right? Like I feel like the worlds need to be merged more. I feel like that's the new like we need to be actually extending the conversations laterally, and not staying as, I feel like theater as a pillar is not something that's going to be mighty. I feel like theater people have the capacity beyond being theater people. For what I've been using theater people for is memory people, right? They have great body memory, so they could learn history. They could recite concepts. They could remember things better than teachers can. I'm like shocked at the capacity of theater students for remembering and embodying like history concepts. So that's why that's why a lot of my projects are like working on games of filtering historical concepts in and around students and in and around like Indigenous creators that can really feel it, and it's just, you remember more, when you've walked it.
Yeah, my original desire for what we'll call interdisciplinary was a sense of wanting to explode what I knew or what I normally worked with, or find new ways of expressing something. Yeah, and now I've been working more in the theatrical world, but I've done in situ and, all types of other performative work. So anyway, I don't know. That was what I wanted to share. I guess I could talk about student research, the research with students. And so working now the last few years more with the actual script and not devising work, and working towards a theatrical performance. My research would be, how do I bring what I did, say, before or not in theater into theatrical, more traditional theatrical ways of working. So how does Viewpoints, which is more open in terms of, more open, levels out the playing field in terms of story and movement and everything being equal, so maybe more of a deconstructionist approach. How do I bring that into the world of a hierarchy with story on top, and what does that create? What tensions does it create? And how can it maybe help bring out the story that we're telling? And then also more embodied practices, and how do I blend that with, say, very physical approach to acting, where we're really looking at embodying a character. So that's what I'm researching, I'd say. How do I bring that world, how does that world blend with a traditional theatrical approach? Yeah.
It's interesting, I think, obviously there's the part of research that's just sort of studious, that's just, finding out as much as you possibly can and learning about your subject material. But I also feel like it's what takes this balance between the input and the output, and how much I know that for myself, if I'm in a research mode, I know when I have to cap it, because I've kind of taken in too much, and it starts to sort of drown my own thoughts and ideas. And then conversely, when I've been too internalized, it's like I know now I need to go and do a little bit of research to kind of like tamper my own whirlpool. So I also think not only is it sort of just the act of doing the research, it's sort of figuring out the timing and the pacing of researching anything, in terms of balancing, what are you absorbing and what are you trying to bring out creatively, and it's this constant sort of push and pull there. So.
Yeah, I'm finding this conversation really interesting, because for me, my practice over the last 20 years has gone from much more devised work to a much more traditional theater practice. And it's interesting how my work as a deviser has really impacted how I approach traditional theater, in a sense of like creating a room and the work, and I feel like that it's a very important part of my work. And I think in many ways where I mean, you know, there's when I do a play, there's always the research that you're speaking to of like, you know, whatever the topics or the playwright or all of the things that you research. But in many ways, I feel like the focus for me around my research has been, how do I create a space in which people want to take risk and want to be like bringing themselves into the room in a way that is dynamic and risk-taking and scary and pushes them, while at the same time feeling held in a container. And I think that for me it's an important part of theater making, and I think something that's being challenged a little bit at the moment in traditional theater is how to balance this idea of safety and the idea of being risk-taking. How do those two things live together in a dynamic space? And I think for me, that's a place, a very interesting place to work and think about and push myself and I think my team of like, how do we do that? So anyways, it's interesting because I feel like, yeah, listening to all of you speak, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm really just doing theater right now in my practice. So it's interesting that shift that I've made, and that I don't contextualize that in a way of like, I mean, I think about it sometimes how my devised work lives in my practice now, but it's interesting to reflect on it a little bit more and think, oh, this is actually, it's a big part of how I approach a piece. Yeah. That's all.
Thanks. Yeah, that's not the first time that question, the idea of risk and safety and in the environments that we work in. I mean, things have changed. Things are always changing in terms of the resources we have to make theater with a capital T, if I can say that, or just being able to find some basic resources, even space, right, to start to jump into some kind of a creative process. I come from, you know, I'm also actually a graduate of the theater department from, yeah, I guess I would say the early 90s. And the first people I started to create with were actually clowns. They were trained at Lecoq, but I met them in Toronto. And I think what that experience instilled in me was that I couldn't take anything for granted. And like this is like Toronto days, working in church basements that smell like gas leaks and making coffee that burns because you forget because it's in another room, and then somehow transferring all that creativity and coming around like an idea or a word to make a story. And then how somehow having that be transformed but also translate into another space, and then start to have all these other edges, and the way it gets molded because design enters the process, dramaturgy enters the process. So I'm kind of riffing on that to kind of come back to, I guess, this notion of performance creation. So I started teaching in the department in 2016, and all of a sudden there was something called performance creation. I'm like, well, what is that? You're like, what is that? Because I think back in the old days, I was like, we're just making new work, I think. I don't know if anybody else will see, if it'll see daylight ever, or anybody else will witness this, but you know, this is what's happening right now. But I remember that feeding my soul so much, while I also had to pick up other gigs and do other things in life. And because I'm hoping some of these conversations are for like all sorts of people, but also some of our students and graduates who are tuning in. Like, what is the question I'm asking? I don't know, but it's a reflection on, I guess, taking care of your own creative habits and making meaning in your own way. So like you say, Mindy, you know, you started off maybe more thinking about it like doing devised work, creating work from scratch, And it's something right now that's going on is a little bit more of what's formed or more conventional work, so that there's a shifting all the time and keeping our practices alive, I guess. So again, I'm just commenting, but I don't know if other people have other thoughts on, all the things that inform the collaboration, and with who do you bring around what you want to do, and the conditions of this that creates. Does there always have to be a goal to be witnessed publicly?
I think I spent a really long time creating, like, with mentors who were in their 80s, 70s and 80s. Like, I did it on purpose because I feel like they have more voice in a way, or they're just willing to do it and try it and say it. So mentoring with really senior artists has been super, super interesting in that approach. Like, and I feel like taking whoever's lead it is to say, we're all going to do this thing about this glass versus we have nothing, let's start as a group, has been the most interesting approach. Like, I've had the chance to work with Spider Woman Theater for many years in New York City, and then doing kind of like a retake on like an old production that's been 40 years ago, that was created 40 years ago on like Native women violence, right? So this combination of like trying to merge with some processes that were established in the 70s also, and like working in kind of like creative modes that I wouldn't necessarily have the guts to throw together toward an outcome. Like it's this like blind faith that I've been really honed in, and I'm just intrigued by all of your practices and kind of like the difference between starting clear in a way, like, and versus starting where you've been saying like with a word or with an impetus. Like I'm just intrigued in like kind of where your starting spaces are when you're working in this kind of collaborative mode.
For me, it's usually thematic. If my interest in, I've been doing several Oresteias and different adaptations of Oresteia over the last few years, but it all started from an invitation to look at the notion of Furies and female, and so I became curious about female anger and expression. So that's like an ongoing slow work that's in development. That's a creation piece in process. But I'm always starting with a subject, usually. So one time at Studio 303, I did the thing where they did, what was it? They don't do it anymore. Edgy Women Festival. Do you know that? Where they give you they give you a prompt, a song, and then you build a project in like 3 weeks. So that was the one time I did find the theme, the content, through those suggestions. But usually it's from a passion about life experience.
I feel like there's the category of when you have a completed work that's handed to you that you need to figure out how to bring to life. There's sort of when it's just one particular theme. I know it's happened to me where I've, through work, write a show about Leonard Cohen or about Russian poetry. And then that's sort of, bit more of requires a certain type of research, but a type of research that then requires more imaginative and, interpretation and writing and finding story and themes, et cetera, and creating scripts out of it. And then there's the complete blank page, which is do anything you want, and then you have to sit there and figure out, what do I really care about right now? And I think, even just saying that, I think we can get kind of academic about what we think we should be doing and subject matter we should be touching on. And I think, it has to have the truth of the thing that you're actually that you really care about. Like someone in the room has to really, really believe in this one thing. So I think just listening to that and being able to sit back and think, okay, what do I really, really want to say right now? Where are my interests heading? Where is my mind always going? So there's that side of it. this is a very kind of silly image I've always had, but when I was in 6th grade, I told my students this, when I was in 6th grade, there was in my math class, we had something called a function machine. It was like an exercise where our teacher had drawn sort of a machine that looked kind of like a Dr. Seuss machine, and it was a math exercise. So you put in a number, and let's say you put in 6, and if you get 13, and then you put in 2, and you get 5, then you basically figure out that it's like times 2 plus 1 or something like that. So I always had this image that it's like we had to figure out like the function machine of ourselves, that if we take something in, like if we do the research, whether it's the source material or just I have to write something about the sunset, that it's like we put it through the function machine of our being, all Dr. Seuss-like, and then we, then something comes out the other end, and sort of defining, learning through time, like what is the nature of your personal function machine, and what's your voice, and what's your impact, and everything, and being conscious of that without, while still respecting the source material. So anyway, so that's my little addition, the little Dr. Seuss function machine. But
I like that. Yeah, I think for me it's also thematic in a sense of, and I think the thing that, or the ideas that always pull me forward are specifically around a female experience or different female experiences, and also the place of a human experience that feels vulnerable or complicated or a little bit crunchy, I guess is how I think about it, is a little bit crunchy. That those stories always attract me or pull me forward, and like how do we put something on stage and have a conversation around something that feels uncomfortable? That's, for me, is something that's very rich artistically. So that I would say is something, if I would look at my work, that would be a theme for sure. Yeah, that the next play I'm thinking about doing for my company has a cast of a lot of older women, and I'm really loving the potential of doing that play. Hasn't been totally set yet, but the idea of being in a room, with 6 women who are in their 70s and 80s, and just that opportunity to share space with them and create something with them, and what the difference that is to working with younger people, like all of that. I'm really fascinated by that opportunity, and I think so rare, right, to see older women on stage. And anyway.
Definitely, yes, yeah. Yeah, I mean, how do you take care of these impulses, I think was the word you used, Shauna, earlier, to start to build community around something that you want to investigate, right? And what are those starting points? And I'm kind of interested in your I guess it's kind of like, again, it's like, is it not to get all academic about it, but it's like, how are you doing what you're doing? I mean, these are the things I always love to impart to in the classroom. It's always the most interesting thing. So, in terms of this like slow theater, like what does that, like how do you do that? Like how are you thinking about how are you doing that right now, Leslie? And what is I don't want to say like the payoff of that, but what is the impulse for that right now in this time, and what would be an example of how you're moving in a slow theater practice, slowly?
Well, part of it's very practical, of getting the money, but I also find it, the more interesting part of it is that it's giving time for my images to arise and to figure out to let the subject in a way speak to me. And I'll call myself a slow thinker, but I don't know, it just may be a way of processing and coming to a way of expressing something. So it can be, the way this project has manifested is that like a week workshop, trying some ideas and then allowing some time to pass and things ferment and grow, and I find they become more specific, so maybe it's physical researching on our feet as well as reading and looking at images and stuff, and then coming back to it, and then so going back and forth. So so maybe an annual workshop, twice a year workshop, and it's becoming more and more specific. So going from less clarity to more clarity in terms of, the content and the form and, So,
Do you find that the time between the workshops, the reflection, that you're really in a different place from when the last, all the incubation period? I'm just imagining, I'm so often in the opposite situation where, I have 1 week to do a whole thing and everyone's working, 13 hours a day, and you feel like you don't have any recul, distance. And I'm just wondering what it's like to come back to the work after such a, after a long gap, if you really feel like you're in a different place.
Yeah, I feel like it becomes more specific and more defined, and and for instance, there's a solo monologue in this piece, and then there's more performative installation type embodiment of other women and embodying images of, say, violence against women or expression of female rage. But then lately I've been reading about ancient Greek theater and rhapsoids and bards and storytelling, and taking some pleasure in thinking about the history of Greek Western theater, Greek theater, and how it evolved, and is that a form for which this piece is going to be held within. So I come back to it with more info. Yeah, and then the people I collaborate with bring things that inspire me. Yeah.
I'm sure it's interesting because also the world is in a different place too. So
Yeah, and sometimes I wish I'd work faster because I feel like the subject's passed. And I love compression. I love working quickly too. I think there's beautiful things that can come from that. But I also like time to think and process and then come back to the studio. Sometimes I find it can be really intense to work those 8-hour days and produce. But also then, nice. You have to trust our instincts. And I think there's some wonderful things that can come from that. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Like the coming back and kind of like spending a significant amount of times away. Like I feel like the difference between what I'm doing in classes, which is like, let's rush to an end, let's make something we know it's a work in progress. It's not, this isn't a production. But the way that I'd worked previously in Toronto was doing so much of that work that the sentiment starts popping up and you're like, oh my God, like this piece is writing itself. It's just, but my gauge I'm having a problem with, I tend to have a bit of an issue with over the years, has been I research so intensely. I have physical, just piles and piles of things that I think are so important, especially when it comes to Indigenous context, right? There's so many narratives I can generate, so many things that could pop up. So how much do I need to stop, wait, let's throw something at some people. A lot of the work that I have is verbatim text that's generated by sending my crew out to go gather interviews 3 years ago. All of my work starts with an interview phase, all of it continues on to seeing what pops up if we throw it through a story weaving filter through the Spider Women's techniques. What if we pop it up through, my current work, working with Monique Mojica and a bunch of other kind of embodied creators, working with sound makers and deep poetry, kind of let's play with pottery patterns. Let's really play with pottery patterns and directionality, and let's really see what it wants us to tell us, and let's read them like we're reading a physical embodied scores, and sound, actually creating things, feeling let's have the object tell us what to do, has been really interesting because I can't rush that work. And I feel like the kind of contemporary realities of what I'm dealing with influences the work slowly over the years that it's building. The work that I'm working on now is about loves and losses surrounded by all of this archaeological research, disrupted lovers because of excavations. What does that do to the souls of the bodies that had been interred, right? When we really get into the kind of stories and figure out where's the beauty in the narrative, where are the kind of personal bits, where are the things, and how much of your life needs to influence it has been really nice. There's this losses I've experienced, and being closer to death, and moments where you're oh, that's what it needs to be to have people believe me. Takes time, and I feel like all the projects that I've worked on have taken 3-5 years to make a script. And that's a hell of a thing for regular theater to deal with. So I've been really grateful to kind of Centaur, to letting, plus we got a good time break for that production because they're redoing their stage. So we're gonna be the first troupe in their new season on the new stage with a fly system, right? So the whole game is now, how do we design something for a fly system, right? How do I use Indigenous creators and production people and gather the right people? Because that took forever, trying to find a full team of Indigenous production, an entire production team, and all performers, 12 or so individuals from across Montreal, all Indigenous. That hasn't happened in Toronto. It hasn't happened in Montreal for a long time. So I'm just intrigued by kind of like the long-term returning to a discussion, and kind of like what makes us come back to the same topic. Like you say, you're working with the same topic for a while. I think that's really interesting. Like, it's like you're never done. You're never done when you're collaboratively creating.
Giving it time, and I keep kind of going back to what time. Okay, so we're at 5. Speaking of time, no, I love this conversation about, like, basically giving oneself permission, right, to take time. And we live in a world where we're overperforming, and the productivity is alive and well. And how do we practice a little bit more of that kind of misperformance or underperformance? And how do we convey the value of that, and being stuck or uncomfortable or feeling, I guess, unsettled in those moments of creative processes where you're giving it time because the objective or the outcome doesn't actually matter in this moment. And I'm just thinking about how, for me, that as an educator is one of the toughest things to convey, also within a very specific period of time, 12 weeks or a 6-week intensive. So maybe as a way of kind of moving towards the end of our conversation and opening up for a Q&A, if there's folks out there who have questions. I'm just curious about what advice, what would you say to, the emerging artists that we're all involved with, educating or collaborating with, moving forward, about, like, finding that place to be okay in the discomfort of the creative process or the performance creation? What advice would you give?
Globally, I mean, I was going to quickly respond to the time thing, just because that
Yeah,
really. Okay.
well, it's related,
I mean,
yeah.
I most often. I mean, I feel like I'm trying to think of a moment when that wasn't the case. Have very firm deadlines, and so I often try to. It's like a mind game. I pretend like I have to work like there's a fire under my butt, but I also have to pretend that we have all the time in the world, and to project that to my cast or my students. And that's, I feel like, in particular, kind of a skill, because you do need to feel like this is just unending, and anything's possible, and I need to be, I need to reflect, and I need to breathe, and all of those things at the same time. You need, so it's a funny little tight wire that I think you need to develop if you're in, especially, in the commercial sector, as particularly. It's funny. It actually reminds me. My father is a writer. And I was reading, the Rilke, not Rilke, oh goodness. Is it Rilke? The Letters to a Young Poet. Yes, okay, yeah. And there's this whole part about how he's saying, you have to let, like, stand tall in the through the snows of winter, and like the trees that know that spring will come, and have patience. And I was reading this to my father, and he says, sounds like Rilke had a day job. And so that's so yes, there's that aspect of it, of like having to sort of be like the trees in winter, and having that patience, and yet also knowing to figure out how to play the mind game of still having the deadline. But that was my little riff on the time thing. I don't think that's the advice I would give to young creators, particularly. Here, I'll let you.
Yeah, we're all like,
We'll come back. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there is a practical part of creating work that I think is important to talk about, like in a sense of funding, or if you're being hired, the process that somebody else is giving you, how you work within that frame. Like, I think it's such a broad, because I think there's so many different ways to create theater. I mean, I think we all, just the four of us, we have very different practices, and so the structure of how that is, of our work, how it is created, there are different kinds of demands that allow us to do things in a different way. And I think being observant of those or aware of those, I think, is really important as an artist, to be to understand the work that you're doing. And, you know, if you want to be somebody who is going to work in a more commercial setting, then you are going to work in an atmosphere where somebody else is dictating your schedule. There's not really a lot of getting around that. Like, you're going to have 3 weeks, and then you're going to be up, and you're going to do it, you know, like that. And if you're not working in that way, and you're working in a way that can take longer and has more capacity for breath and strength or stretch, then there are different components. So I guess what I would say is to be aware of what you're interested in doing, and what is the frame that you're wanting to work in, and being aware of what are the existing structures and expectations of within those frames, or what are the possibilities even within those frames, and also, you know, to understand that those frames can be pushed and stretched and should be, you know, questioned, and also that's probably a slow-moving project too, right? So it's how to, just to come into something with sort of awareness of what you're working in, and where are the places that you see potential to push and stretch, and where are the things that are kind of immovable pillars, and but also to do things that you love to do. I think that would be my main thing, is do what you love to do, because because it's a great thing to do.
Yeah, honor what you love to do.
Honor what you love to do.
Yeah.
I think that is it for me, for sure. Honor what you love to do.
Will change.
And it will change and
over-
grow.
Yeah.
Yeah, change and grow, and shift, and
It's not going to be one thing.
no.
I'm sorry, it could be many things simultaneously. I mean, that's the other thing, is that you can find deep pleasure in one facet of your work, and I mean, you can keep a lot of pots on the stove at once, and get different types of pleasure from different types of work, and find ways of doing it simultaneously. And as well, it's sometimes surprising. I've had deep pleasure in work that was completely commercial and on paper not at all something that I thought I would find enriching, and I've done projects that were 100% for them to be enriching, and they turned out not to be enriching. So it's really, I mean, you do have to, you know, listen to the joy, but be open-minded to where it can actually be resting. Yeah.
I take my cue, work with senior artists. Why not? I think that the thing that we really have to bank on is preparing students to kind of like capture some of the possible collaborations that are within our networks. I feel like that's a big barrier, is the kind of being spit out after your graduating year into the nowhere land and trying to make it on your own, when we actually have students need to know how to put their foot in a space in a particular way to make themselves indispensable. I think a lot about the side games that people need to have as theater creators, particularly the creators that I work around, that have to have side hustles. We need to be able to facilitate. We need to be able to run community programming. We need to be able to work within community settings, and kind of like not necessarily like things that are adjacent to what we'd consider professional theater, but working in and around those spaces is super, super, super useful to keep yourself in kind of just present at an organization that will then understand that your projects take time. And so kind of letting yourself co-write toward things, because I think the granting system is going to change slowly to be able to understand that durational projects and things that take years and years to develop are things that people want, and that the kind of community buy-in and all those processes that I've been fighting for so long in Toronto and working in Toronto, because I don't see it echoed here as much as I'd like, you know, I feel like we still need to be forcing people toward that. Where I'm like, get yourselves in the door. Ask the people who you think are making spectacular work to work with them, you know, and then figure out the company that will help you co-write the grant to make that something that's actually feasible, and co-facilitate projects with them. I tell all my participants, like, whatever you're really great at, let's break off a workshop component, because for me and for the people that I know that I work with, we have to be co-facilitating something on beside our work. Just in Toronto, you gotta have 3 hustles. So I think like that kind of work is super important, to be able to kind of be the own, you know, understand that you deeply understand this content. So you've been working on it for years now. Let's figure out what you could use that's not only a theatrical outcome, but that's something that will bring people into your world. Is something that I'm really intrigued by. Yeah. And endlessly making facilitators, just like growing facilitators. Like part of my work is like co-growing facilitators with me, so I'm not the only one sharing content, right? Like especially because the stuff I'm engaging with, I don't want to be the only one, right? I can't be the only voice. So there has to be younger people and people side next to me that are able to kind of like pick up a lot of the same information and do their own games with them. But yeah.
Well, and I agree with everything I've heard. I'm like, oh, I should take some notes. But I'd add, throw into the pot, keeping in your practice in whatever form, you know? Like even, you know, if you have people you feel good working with in school, that those are good foundations for collaborations after. And even if it's just, I don't know, viewpoints in your living room or on the street or whatever your practice is, to try to keep in it, because then I find it keeps me nourished and gives me more energy and enthusiasm for moving forward. And on top of everything else that everybody said, looking for the source of nourishment as well to keep the drive alive, maybe. Yeah.
I feel like the flip side of that is don't work from a place of fear. I think that's the one thing I would say, that I think that as much as you can tap into your enthusiasm and not your fear, and I think not only are other people will be more influenced by your enthusiasm for something and want to embark, but it just, it makes you more clear-headed and energetic and all of those things. That's the only thing I would say is just, and avoid fear.
Yeah, or I would say avoid fear, or like find the people that you trust to come around something you're really afraid of trying. Too, you know, like, maybe that's a little.
Yes, actually, the kind of fear that is something that's intimidating, and avoid the fear of
not doing, like, so you don't end up doing nothing.
Don't work from a place of terror. I should maybe fear is good, not terror.
And on that note, wow, thank you so much for your really thoughtful, insightful reflections on kind of like, we moved around a few things, but it all connects. So thank you. And I'm just wondering if we have any folks with us live in the audience or online who have questions for our guests today.
Hi. So I'm a theater student here at Concordia, and I've had the privilege to work with Shauna, and now I'm working with Leslie. And going back on the conversation about interdisciplinary work is super interesting, because the show that I worked on with Shauna was really different disciplines: theater, dance, circus, and learning what that means in a theater context. And now working with Leslie, and also the show that I worked with Shauna on was based off of a poem, and we just like created this huge world. And like now on the flip side, I'm working with Leslie with a script and with specific characters and like relationships, but then finding what interdisciplinary means in quote unquote like theater with a capital T, as Shauna said, and like interdisciplinary from different lineages, Grotowski, Overlie, Stanislavski, like finding. So what I'm trying to say is that in my years here at Concordia, it's really helped me define A, what theater is, and B, what theater can be. And that there is intersectionality in the lineages of theater and also in different performance arts. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Lamia.
Anyone on Zoom have a question?
Okay. Do you have a question? Leslie has a question.
Did I understand you to say earlier that you start with the group and then discover the content?
It depends. It depends on what we're going for, where we're starting. Like, I guess that's the process that I do, that I was trained in creating with Spider-Woman Theater, this kind of like story weaving process that is truly like, she always starts like, what's your druthers, really? Like, she's, she's old, right? What's your druthers? What do we want to do? What would we like to start with? How are we gonna start up, right? So that's one of those things that really like gets you kicking. But it picks a lot of things up. But I rarely do that. I have, I start from a tangible thing often. Very often it's like material or like something that I'm just really intrigued by, or some burial site that I found on the corner over there. And you just go so deep into the archaeological records, and that's where the beef is. That's where the content is. But that stuff is like not only in theater. Like I do curation for like street art, Toronto murals, and like I'm doing kind of collaborations with like how do we share that research, even like to now, like the research I'm doing, like how do we share the pottery patterns on unearthing back with the Wendat Nation, whose pottery patterns they are, right, from Toronto. So the kind of like deep history and kind of like reciprocal, or like kind of like community reciprocity that's part of the uncovering content is like really, really, really important in my work. It's not how other people work, but like I feel like that's a huge portion of my work, is like, how do I send something back to whoever's, this content really is, whose patterns are these? And yeah, allowing the students actually the agency, though, in that particular context, like allowing students the agency to play with the content, but then also know that it's not theirs to keep, is a very interesting thing we're going to be engaging with for this process. Yeah, so I just want to say, there's lots of, I never start from nowhere, personally, I don't like it. But I do story creation work with my students, and we very often hit on, like at Center for Indigenous Theater, we would hit on something between the first 3-4 stories where I'd be like, this is what we're doing, this is where we're going, let's jump on this. But like, yeah, leaving it open for like the first day or so, and then you really gotta hone in fast in a fast process. Yeah.
Thanks, Ange. Any last comments from any other guests? Okay. Well, what a pleasure, again, to get your insights and perspectives and hear more about your practice and the weaving. There was some weaving going on here between you all. That was really inspiring. So thanks a lot for your time and energy. Thank you. Now, hand it over to our team at ForSpace.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming into ForSpace and activating this conversation today. For those of you online and here in the space, thank you for your questions and your contributions as well. We're going to be closing up the Zoom and live stream, but a quick reminder that this conversation is already available on our YouTube channel if you'd like to revisit or share it. So please join us again at ForSpace, and thanks again. Have a great evening, everyone.